All right, everyone. Thanks for being a little flexible when it came to getting this video uploaded. This is all going to be about chapter 13, which is talking about some microbial diversity that we see, which includes some prokaryotes as well as eukaryotes that are fungi and protists. So this is the first of the next three chapters that are all about diversity. So today is microbes. Next week is going to be plants, and then the week after that is animals. So this is a lot of information. Just make sure that when you are reviewing this information that you step back and really look at the big picture. What are the important takeaways from this? Pretty much when it comes to quiz questions, it's going to be big picture things, overarching themes. Why are certain things grouped together? What do certain groups have in common, and what makes them different from other groups? So try not to get caught up in too much of the nitty gritty. But again, when it comes to these quizzes, they are open book and open note, but just make sure you're reviewing the material beforehand. Okay, so when it comes to microbial diversity, there is a lot. Microbes are everywhere. But I think one of the things that a lot of people assume is that microbes are bad, which is not entirely true. Pretty much everything that's on Earth depends on bacteria or some other microbe in one way or another. Sure, there are microbes that can be bad, but there are a lot of microbes that are good as well. So we're going to talk about some of the bad, but some of the good also here during the lecture. When it comes to what a microbe actually is, it can be a lot of different types of organisms, but that organism can only be seen with the help of a microscope. So it's nothing that we can see with just our naked eyes. We are going to need a microscope to see the details about this organism. So there are 4 types of microbes we find in the world. We've got bacteria and archaea, so those are our prokaryotes. And then we have some protists that are microbes and some fungi that are microbes. We're going to talk about protists and fungi today. Not all of those are microbes. Some of them are a lot bigger, but some of them are microbes that are kind of all grouped together here in this lecture. The first forms of life that we see on Earth were prokaryotes. Prokaryotes existed before we had eukaryotes. These first prokaryotes, it's estimated that life arose around 4 billion years ago, which is a long time. And these prokaryotes existed for billions of years before eukaryotes came around. As far as the actual origin of life, there are many hypotheses out there about how life came to be. Some deal with cold temperatures in the ice that kind of slowed some things down. Lightning is involved in one of the hypotheses. So there's lots of different hypotheses out there, but we don't really know. It was a long time ago, and those things aren't readily fossilized, and so it's tough to really narrow down how life originated. We do know that the atmosphere in the Earth was originally anoxic. So anoxic means there's no oxygen there. So when there's no oxygen, the only things that can survive are organisms that are anaerobic. Remember, we talked about that word anaerobic when we were talking about cellular respiration. Respiration that occurs without the presence of oxygen is anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic organisms are able to live in these anoxic environments. So eventually we had some blue-green algae, which are a photosynthetic cyanobacteria that evolved from our anaerobic bacteria, and those are the organisms that began to fill the atmosphere with oxygen. Once the atmosphere was filled with oxygen, then it allowed for the evolution of other life forms. And then these photos down here are just showing a couple pictures of that photosynthetic cyanobacteria. Here we've got a timeline of prokaryotes and just sort of the evolution of life on Earth. So we have the origin of Earth estimated around 4.6 billion years ago. And then we have the origin of prokaryotic life anywhere from 4.2 to 3.8 BYA, so billions of years ago. Then we have the origin of photosynthesis, so our cyanobacteria are coming in. And then it takes a while. It takes about 1 billion years, but oxygen starts to accumulate in the atmosphere here around 2.4 billion years ago. Once we have that, you can see we start to get a lot of other forms of life developing. We've got our multicellular organisms, our animals, our plants, and then way down here we've got our earliest humans. So this is a big timeline, and humans have only been around for a very, very small portion of it. I posted this really, really cool video on D2L that is linked right here also. It's about the history of Earth, and it kind of outlines the history of Earth on a football field. It helps you kind of see how far apart these events actually were and how much happened fairly recently as far as the geologic time scale goes. So on that football scale, if we're talking about human evolution, the humans that were first seen, if we're talking about a football field, are about 1/8 of an inch from the end zone, right? Like if our origin of Earth is at one end zone, we go all the way to the other end of the football field, and 1/8 of an inch away from that other end zone is where humans start to show up. So we have really not been around that long compared to this whole geologic time scale that we see. So I definitely recommend you check out that video. It's really cool. So before we had an oxygenated atmosphere, the Earth was a pretty harsh place to be. It had some pretty strong radiation. We didn't have that oxygen in the atmosphere to protect us from some strong radiation. So as far as life on Earth in those really harsh conditions, they're going to thrive where they're really protected. So below the Earth's surface, maybe deep in the ocean, somewhere where they're not exposed to such strong radiation. So this earliest form of life that we see are these things called microbial mats. They're these layered sheets of prokaryotes that form these films. These can be either prokaryotes, bacteria, or archaea, but these microbial mats are the earliest forms of life that we see. The first microbial mats likely obtained their energy from hydrothermal vents. So this is, in the ocean, down at the ocean floor, we have this crack in the crust, and it releases this really hot water. So the energy that these first microbial mats likely obtained were from these vents. And then the fossils that we see that are the earliest evidence of these microbial mats are called stromatolites. So it's this microbial mat that has trapped sediment. So these are the earliest known fossils. This is what we're seeing as our earliest form of prokaryotes, these stromatolites. So just to remind you what a prokaryote is, it is a unicellular organism that lack membrane-bound organelles. So when we're talking about those microbial mats, yes, those are lots of prokaryotes, but they are lots of individual prokaryotes. They're not, that microbial mat is not one organism. It is composed of many, many unicellular organisms. And these prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles. That's something we only see in our eukaryotes. But things that prokaryotes do have, they have a plasma membrane. This membrane is a little bit different between the two types of prokaryotes, bacteria and archaea. And then some prokaryotes also have a cell wall outside of their membrane. Not all of them have a cell wall, but some of them do. And that cell wall is different in bacteria and archaea. And then this bacterial and archaea, these prokaryotic cell walls are different than the cell walls we see in eukaryotes, like we see in plant cells. So the structure is different. Prokaryotes also have cytoplasm, so they have that jelly-like substance inside the cell where everything is kind of suspended. They have genetic material, right? They don't have a nucleus because that's a membrane-bound organelle, and they don't have chromosomes, but they do have that circular piece of DNA that's in the nucleoid region, right? So this should all sound familiar from our cell chapter that we talked about. And then prokaryotes also have ribosomes. We just talked about ribosomes in chapter 9 when we were talking about the central dogma of molecular biology, talking about how ribosomes are really important for the creation of proteins. These prokaryotes need to be creating proteins also. So that's why they have ribosomes, right? Working in this protein synthesis. When it comes to the different types of prokaryotes that we see, there are 3 general categories of prokaryotes, and it's all based on what they look like, the shape of these prokaryotes. So we've got some spherical prokaryotes here, the cocci shape right there. We've got bacilli-shaped or rod-shaped prokaryotes, and then we also have these spirilla-shaped, these spiral-shaped prokaryotes that we see. So we're going to have them fit into one of the 3 categories here. This is how prokaryotes are generally divided. When it comes to reproduction of prokaryotes, this is primarily asexual reproduction. This is not mitosis. Okay, so we talked about mitosis and asexual reproduction, but prokaryotes don't do mitosis. Mitosis is just something that eukaryotes do, right? Because we have those chromosomes involved. So prokaryotes don't have chromosomes. So they can't do mitosis. They do something called binary fission, which is very, very similar to mitosis. It's just not mitosis. Okay, so this is kind of what binary fission looks like here. So we have our original cell, our DNA gets replicated. Remember, this circular piece of DNA is going to get replicated. Then we start to get the formation of this septum, and then our cells separate. Okay, so it looks very similar, but again, this is not mitosis because mitosis is just for eukaryotes. And in this binary fission, we don't have any opportunities for genetic recombination for these genes to get mixed around between individuals. But there are ways that prokaryotes can still change up their genetics. So we're going to go over those now. So they can do something called transformation. So this is where the cell is going to take up DNA that's found in the environment. It's in the environment because it's been shed by other prokaryotes. So another prokaryote can come along and find some DNA and just pick it up and incorporate it right into their circular piece of DNA. We could also have transduction. So this is where we have a virus that's involved. So these viruses that infect bacteria are called bacteriophages, and they can move DNA from one individual to another. They can pick up DNA from one bacteria and then put it into another bacteria. So that's another way that prokaryotes can change up their genetics. And then the third one is called conjugation. So where DNA is transferred from one to another via a plasmid. So in addition to having these circular pieces of DNA, they also have little plasmids in their cytoplasm that are just little pieces of DNA, and it can get transferred from one prokaryote to another through conjugation. Prokaryotes show a lot of variation in how they obtain energy. Basically, if it's a way to obtain energy, a prokaryote can do it. Okay, so we have two categories of autotrophs, so self-feeders, and we have two categories of heterotrophs. So they get their energy from a few different places and their carbon from a few different places. So they can get their energy from sunlight, or they can get their energy from inorganic chemicals or organic chemicals. And then they can get their carbon from carbon dioxide. So a photoautotroph, very similar to how plants photosynthesize, right? Getting their carbon from CO2 and then using energy from the sun. But we also have these heterotrophs down here that are getting their carbon from other organic compounds. Okay, so so lots of variation as far as prokaryotes obtaining energy. So some prokaryotes, I said at the beginning that a lot are really helpful, but some are harmful. Bacteria specifically have caused a few pandemics. We're in a pandemic right now, but that is a viral pandemic, but there have been some that are caused by bacteria also. This is just a few that were mentioned in your textbook. The plague of Justinian was back in 540 to 750 AD. Likely was a type of bubonic plague. We don't really know because, it's hard to compare that kind of data. But the world population declined by 25%, and in Europe it declined by half. That is a crazy reduction in the number of people on the planet. And then we had another outbreak of bubonic plague in the 1300s called Black Death. So this is something that's carried by fleas that live on rats. And this one in the 1300s killed about 100 million people. So some pretty crazy pandemics that have been caused by bacteria. But again, a lot of these bacteria are really good. We use these every day. There are beneficial prokaryotes in a lot of our food and drink products. Cheese, salami, yogurt, fish sauce, a lot of things that we eat all the time. We need bacteria to make all of this stuff happen. So there's a lot of good bacteria out there as well. We can also use prokaryotes for something called bioremediation. This is where we're removing pollutants from the environment, from the water, from the air, from the soil. There are some prokaryotes that can eat and metabolize oil. So these can be used to clean up oil spills. We've got decomposers that are prokaryotes involved in sewage treatment. So a lot of bioremediation happening with these beneficial prokaryotes. And then we also have beneficial prokaryotes just inside our body. So we have 10 to 100 times as many bacterial cells as human cells in our body. So we are, as we're going off the number of cells, there are way more bacterial cells than there are human cells in our body. We've got them in our gut. We've got them on our skin. There's been a lot of research out there about the beneficial microbes we have in our gut. Not as much research done on the ones on our skin, but pretty big area of research right now talking about this microbiome that we have in our human bodies. When it comes to the diversity seen in microbes, we touched briefly on the fact that there are two domains of these prokaryotes, right? There's bacteria and archaea. So when it comes to bacteria, these again are prokaryotic. They have cell walls made of this substance called peptidoglycan. So there are two categories of bacteria, and it all has to do with these cell walls made of peptidoglycan. There are gram-positive bacteria and gram-negative bacteria. This has to do with a certain kind of staining that is done on bacteria, and if they react to this stain, they are gram-positive. If they don't, they're gram-negative. They all have these cell walls made of peptidoglycan, but with the gram-positive, it's going to be a really thick cell wall, and with gram-negative, it's going to be a thin cell wall. So we're not going to go into the diversity within bacteria because it is an astonishing level of diversity. But overall, most of them are beneficial, but some of them are harmful. And when they're harmful, they can be really bad, but most of these are going to be beneficial. When it comes to archaea, these are also prokaryotic. And then these were recently discovered back in the 1970s. We talked about this in the previous chapter, but originally these prokaryotes were just grouped into prokaryotes. But then with the advent of more technology that allowed us to really compare the genetics of these, we realized that there are two separate domains, this bacteria and this archaea group. And the archaea group is actually just as different from bacteria as it is from eukaryotes. So they're extremely different than bacteria, but were just recently separated. These are non-pathogenic, so all of those pandemics that we talked about are all bacteria. Archaea are not known to be pathogenic at all. And most of them are what we call extremophiles, meaning that they really like living in extreme environments. So anytime you see phile, that's going to be like loving or thriving, right? We talked about a hydrophilic molecule versus a hydrophobic molecule. Hydrophilic is water loving. So this is going to be extreme loving, an extremophile. So just some examples of that. We've got halophile. So halo refers to salt. So loving living in a really salty environment. We've got a thermophile, loving living in a really, really hot water environment. And then we also have some that like to live at the bottoms of lakes and swamps. So these are really harsh environments, but these archaea can thrive there. So we've got these areas of Yellowstone where we see a lot of archaea. We've got some really salty environments where we see archaea, these extreme environments. So let's move into some of our other microbes, some protists. So a protist is a really big category of organism. It's basically something that is eukaryotic, but it doesn't fit into any of our other categories, right? It's not a fungi, it's not a plant, it's not an animal, it's something else, but it's still a eukaryote. So we get a lot of variety in this protist group. When it comes to their cellular arrangement, because we see such a variety of types of organisms, we see lots of cellular arrangements. We can have organisms that are unicellular, just being by themselves. We can have organisms that are colonial, so lots of unicellular organisms working together. But then we can have some multicellular protists as well that aren't microbial, right? Like kelp is a protist. We can definitely see kelp is a multicellular protist. So lots of different types of arrangements of cells in these protists. There's also a lot of diversity in the way that protists can move. So one of the ways that they can move is with a flagella. This is like a whip-like structure, like a hair that comes off of the cell. This is seen in a few different types of protists. One of the most common ones that's talked about is the Euglena. They have this flagellum, so this hair-like or whip-like structure. We've got a video here where we can kind of take a look. So you can see this flagella right there, just kind of whipping around, helping with locomotion. And here we've got a few different ones, all using their flagellas right there to help with locomotion. Okay, so that's one way that protists can get around. They could also maybe have something called cilia. So instead of having one hair-like structure that comes off of the cell, they can have lots of little hairs that are coming off of the cell. So you can see they're not just on the the sides here, but they're coming across the top and they're on the bottom as well. So this whole structure covered by these tiny little hairs that help with locomotion. Let's take a look at a video for that. Whoop. There we go. So it's got this coordinated movement of these cilia that kind of helps it move around. So little hairs all over the body as opposed to that one whip-like structure. And then we can also have protists that move via a pseudopod. Pseudopod is basically a false foot. So pseudo meaning false, pod meaning foot. So a false foot, pseudopodia. They can kind of extend these structures from their bodies and pull them that way. So a pseudopod is another way that they can move. So this is an example of an amoeba that's moving via a pseudopod. So you can kind of see the cellular contents are moving from this side of the cell toward this side of the cell, and these extensions are just kind of slowly reaching out. So movement via a pseudopod here in this amoeba. So lots of variation in the locomotion we see in protists. We also see a lot of variation in nutrition, right? We can have some photoautotrophs, so some photosynthetic protists that are making their own food with the help of energy from light. We have some heterotrophs that are getting their nutrition from other organisms, right? Intaking other organisms and getting their energy that way. We also have something called mixotrophs, which are basically organisms that can do both. They can make their own food or they can eat other things as food. So those are mixotrophs, a mix of photoautotrophs, and heterotrophs there. And continuing on with our diversity of protists with lots of diverse structures, there's also a lot of types of reproduction that protists can do. They can reproduce asexually, so this would be mitosis, right? These are eukaryotes, so they can use mitosis. They can reproduce sexually, and then they can also do something called alternation of generations, which is where we have a diploid stage and a haploid stage, and we kind of alternate back and forth between these diploid and haploid stages. We're going to talk a lot about alternation of generations next week when we talk about our plants. That's the type of life cycle that plants do. So you don't need to know what it is right now, other than the fact that protists do it, and it alternates between haploid and diploid. So when it comes to the diversity we see within our protist group, this used to be just one kingdom, Kingdom Protista, but now it's 5 separate kingdoms because protists are crazy different, right? They're hard to group together because there is so much variety that we see within the protists. We've got some that are more like plants, some that are more like animals, and so we've grouped them into these 5 kingdoms now. So you can kind of see that we've got some here. You don't need to know the names of these kingdoms. That's not important to me. What's important is you know that protists are made up of 5 different kingdoms. It's not just one big group of protists, 5 different kingdoms. This is just some of the diversity that we see in protists. So I'm just going to go through just a couple examples so you kind of know the types of protists that are out there. So up here, this protist right here, this is actually Giardia. So this is what, if you hear somebody talking about how they drank water out of a stream in the mountains and then they got Giardia, it's this little protist that got into their system. Can cause diarrhea, gas, cramps, upset stomach. It's not a pretty thing to have, but it is caused by this protist here. We've got diatoms down here. Diatoms are some of my favorite protists. They come in a wide variety of shapes and colors. These are photosynthetic, and they make up actually 20% of the global carbon fixation on the planet. Okay, so when we talk about carbon fixation, talking about carbon coming out of the atmosphere and going into an organic molecule, 20% of that on the whole planet is done by these diatoms. And they're made of these little glass shells. So if you look at them under a microscope, you can see all of this crazy diversity. We've also got brown algae. So brown algae is what makes up our kelp forests. So if you've ever been to like the coast of California, there's a lot of these really big kelp forests that are hotspots for some biodiversity. And this kelp looks very plant-like, is actually a protist, a multicellular protist. We've got some examples down here. These 2 pictures here are showing examples of dinoflagellates. So here we've got some a bioluminescent tide activity happening. So these organisms that are causing the water to light up are called dinoflagellates, which are a type of protist. And then we also have some dinoflagellates that can cause these red tides. So these are toxic blooms that can cause major die-offs of fish, seabirds, mammals. So these are very toxic, caused by a dinoflagellate, which is a protist. We've got amoebas over here. So we've got these pseudopods again. This one's also an amoeba, and all of these hair-like structures coming off are also pseudopods, these thread-like pseudopods coming off. So another example of a type of amoeba. And then we've got some other algae down here, red algae and green algae. So lots of variation in the types of protists that we see. Okay, so let's move on from our protists and start talking about the fungi. This is the last type of microbe we're going to talk about, but similar to our protists, not all of them are microbial. So when a lot of people think of fungi, they think of mushrooms, which is true, but it's not just mushrooms. They were once considered to be basically kind of like plants. But they're actually, if you get down to the genetics of it, they're actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants, which is really interesting because you look at a mushroom, kind of looks more like a plant than an animal, but actually more closely related to an animal. These are not photosynthetic, so they can't do photosynthesis. They are heterotrophic, meaning that they are going to need to absorb organic compounds in order to fuel their bodies, fuel that metabolism. But they have something called external digestion. So we have internal digestion, right? We eat food, it's digested inside our body. That is internal digestion. But external digestion, which is where you digest outside of the body and then it's ingested. So enzymes are put out into what you're eating to start digesting it, and then it's absorbed into the body. So external digestion seen in these fungi. When it comes to the structure of fungi, these can be unicellular. So these are the microbes that we're talking about. Those are commonly referred to as yeasts. So yeasts are going to be our unicellular fungi, which are our microbial fungi. But a lot of them can be multicellular, right? Any type of mushroom that you see is going to be a multicellular structure. These are non-modal, so they can't move around. We talked about with the protists how they have some types of locomotion strategies with the flagella and the cilia and the pseudopod, but fungi can't move around. They are non-modal. They also have cell walls that contain chitin. So all fungi have this. This is a distinguishing characteristic for fungi, cell walls with chitin. This is the same compound that's seen in like the shell of a crab or any type of other exoskeleton, so a skeleton that you see on the outside of an animal. It's the same stuff that's in the cell walls of fungi, so helps with structural support. Cell walls made of chitin. And they could also have some bright pigments. Not all of them have bright pigments, but some of them do. So we've got an example here, pretty brightly colored mushroom. This particular mushroom, I'm pretty sure there's a picture in your textbook of it, is a toxic mushroom that can cause some pretty crazy stuff, hallucinations and things like that. Not the same as shrooms, this is different, but can cause some hallucinations there. There are two stages of growth when it comes to fungi. There's a vegetative state. So this is the first stage of growth. And this is made up of these thread-like structures underground called hyphae. So very thin, right? This is a human hair. So we know that our hair is thin. So this is a human hair compared to the hyphae of the fungi. So very, very thin thread-like structures. And when we have a mass of all of these hyphae, it's called a mycelium. Okay, so we've got a mycelium, which is just a mass of these thread-like underground structures. And there is a mycelium that is considered to be the largest organism in the world. So there's a mass of hyphae underground. I believe it's in Oregon, and it's a giant honey mushroom is what it's called. And it's over, I think, like 2,000 square inches, or I can't remember the actual size of it, but it's thought to be over 2,000 years old. And it's just this huge underground mass of these thread-like structures. So that's thought to be the largest organism on Earth. So in addition to the vegetative stage, we also have the reproductive stage. This is where we're actually going to get this reproduction happening. So we're going above ground now. We're no longer underground. And we have this above ground structure that is going to produce something called a spore. So this is different than a seed. It's much smaller, much lighter. And these are going to be able to spread really far through the wind because they are so much smaller and lighter. And this can be sexual or asexual reproduction that's happening here, but in either way, it's going to be the production of spores. So this is I believe it's called a giant puffball mushroom. The reproductive stage here, once it's ready to go, it just kind of pops open, all the spores come out and get carried to wherever they land. This is some of the diversity seen in kingdom fungi. So again, some unicellular, we've got our yeasts down here, and then some multicellular structures as well. We've got some mushrooms here. This is a fungi that's growing on an ear of corn. Some of these fungi can be pretty damaging to crops. So this is an example of that. We've got bread molds. The little blue lines in blue cheese are a type of fungi. And then here's another example of a unicellular fungi. This is something that causes this condition in amphibians where basically their skin just starts to like slough off. It's pretty terrible. A pretty wide variation seen in fungi as well. When it comes to what fungi do in the environment, they are extremely important. They have this really functional role of being decomposers. So they're taking things and recycling these nutrients and putting them back into the soil. So we've got our normal circle of life here, right? We've got plants eating animals and plants giving oxygen to animals, and then the carbon dioxide that animals produce is being picked up by the plants, this nice little circle up here. But then we have our fungi coming in this role of the decomposer. So it's going to be able to take this organic material from dead plants or dead animals, and then it can return these inorganic nutrients to the soil that can be taken up by those plants again. So things like phosphorus and nitrogen, those are some really limiting nutrients for plants, and these fungi help make it available. So these decomposers are helping keep this whole circle going. And they're one of the few things that can break down the cellulose of plants. Not a lot of things can do this, so fungi are really important to help break down plants. Okay, so another thing that fungi do is they form this mutualistic relationship. So when we talk about mutualistic relationships, that means that both things are benefiting. So the fungi is going to benefit and the plant roots are going to benefit. This is called mycorrhiza. So that's the word that is referring to this mutualistic relationship between fungi and plant roots. So the fungi is going to be giving these nutrients to the plants, and the plants are going to be providing food for the fungi, right? Because remember that fungi are not photosynthetic. They can't make their own food. So the plant has to give them those foods. So on the roots of the plant, that's this dark structure here. This is going to be like how roots start out kind of thick and then taper off. So this is going to be the thin parts of the roots that this fungus, this white part right here, surrounds the root. Okay, so once it surrounds the root, it can be providing nutrients directly to that root, and then photosynthetic products like those glucose molecules can go from the leaves that are happening in the plant all the way down to the roots and then go into these fungi here. So this mutually beneficial relationship between plants and fungi, very, very important. There's another mutualistic relationship that fungi have with algae. So these are lichens. So lichens, so this is mutualistic. Both are benefiting, fungi and algae there. Lichens are really important because they're often the first organism that you see in a rocky area. So whether this is a rocky area like some sort of new island that's been formed, and it's nothing but rocks, or maybe a glacier has retreated and it's leaving behind nothing but rocks. So the first things that are going to come in and colonize this area are lichens. They can break down these rocks and start to create soil. And once that soil starts to be created, more organisms can come along. So if you go up for a hike in the mountains, you'll see lichens also. Sort of once you get out of the tree line and are in that high alpine area, you'll see a lot of lichens that are colonizing these rocky areas. So I mentioned that crops are pretty impacted by fungi. So crop diseases caused by fungi can actually cause up to 40% of crops to be lost each year. So this is just a few examples that are seen. I'm pretty sure this picture is straight from your textbook. So not only in things like fruits, but also in grasses like our wheats. So pretty important contributor to crop loss each year. And then there are also fungi that can be pathogenic to humans. Okay, so if anybody has ever had ringworm, that is a fungi, forms this ring-like structure on the skin. Most of these fungal infections are occurring on the skin. Sometimes you can get fungal infections, like an ear infection can be fungal also, but again, it's going to be these external infections. And then this is the one I was talking about with the amphibians that causes their skin to slough off. And then if you've heard of white nose syndrome in bats, that's this fungal infection that's kind of sweeping through the country and decimating bat populations, also caused by a fungus there. So some pathogens and parasites that are members of this fungi kingdom. Then just like with our other microbes, there are good things that fungi do. So they're really beneficial for insecticides. So there is some fungi that can be specifically used to target insects. That can be an insecticide there. Also used in farming, right? That beneficial relationship between fungi and plant roots, really important. And then food and medicine as well. So mushrooms, obviously, a food source. And then medicine. So penicillin is a type of fungi. So medicine as well can use these fungi for beneficial things. All right, so that's all we've got for today. Again, I know this is a lot of information. The plant and animal chapters are also packed full of information. So try to focus on the big things, right? Like, what do all fungi have in common? What do all protists have in common? What do prokaryotes have in common? Those are going to be the most important things. The details aren't unimportant, but just try not to get lost in those details as you're going through the chapter. As always, feel free to let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you guys on Monday at 8 a.m. for our live lecture on plants.